Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for impeccable pronunciation of my name, not once but twice, which is very unusual. I'm delighted to be back at Reed. I haven't been here, I think it's been about 7 years since my last visit. So it's a pleasure for me to be back, and thank you especially to Alex Montgomery for inviting me. I've been thinking about different ways, sort of the different kinds of themes that have animated my understanding of the Afghan state and its experience with formation, destruction, reconstruction in the last several weeks. And the word liminal keeps coming to mind for me. So the notion of liminality or in-betweenness, that's a word that's often mobilized to mark temporal moments of transition, a kind of passage from one stage to another. But if we think about the word spatially as in-betweenness, I think it's an especially helpful framing device for understanding Afghanistan. So I'm going to try and use that concept as an entry point into the work that I've been doing on state formation and state building there. It's impossible to study Afghan state formation without explicitly contextualizing the Afghan state within the international system, and more specifically without recognizing its positionality within that system. So this is one of my favorite paintings by Kerry James Marshall, and I think it beautifully illustrates this in-betweenness. In my conception of it, which was not, I think, Kerry Marshall's conception of it, for me, this is a deconstructed and reconstructed Afghan flag that is compressed between two other spaces of color. And when we talk about Afghanistan, we actually commonly refer to it as a buffer state because since the time of the first sort of modern state builder in Afghanistan, King Abdurrahman Khan, in the late 1800s, it has quite literally found itself in between great powers, the Russians and the British, the Americans and the Soviets, but also ideologically and geopolitically. It has served as an arena for contestation among states that dominate in the neighborhood, which we can call the Greater Middle East. So to study foreign engagement with Afghanistan is to explore fully the implications of what political scientist Steve Krasner has called sovereignty as organized hypocrisy. So he wrote that stronger states can pick and choose among different rules, selecting the ones that best suit their instrumental objectives. So I think in that framing, Afghanistan is a perfect example of a country that has been impacted by this notion that the most powerful states can break the rules at will when their interests would be better served through subversion. So to study Afghanistan's place then in this type of an international system is to consider not just what those international actors are doing, but also the strategies and logics by which Afghan kings and strongmen and diplomats and human rights activists, refugees, have all had to navigate a set of nearly impossible choices, often with tremendous ingenuity and even with success. So to be in between is not only a story of exploitation and vulnerability. In the hands of skillful statesmen, it is actually an asset, whereby the survival of the state becomes in itself a kind of value proposition for those states that are more powerful. So we know, for those of us that study the literature on economic rents, that governments that receive money from foreign funders, we know that those rents can obviate a regime's imperative to forge a social contract with those that it governs. But that produces a kind, what Susan Woodward has called a kind of externalized process of legitimation. So the state's masters are not the people, as they would be in a democracy, but rather the foreign patrons who control the purse strings. Still, foreign subsidies of this kind for the Afghan state, which it has been receiving now for well over 100 years, have allowed many rulers to rule without necessitating the kinds of confrontations that we know are involved in extracting resources, troops, and loyalties from citizens. Of course, when that kind of rent comes with a foreign presence, there are real liabilities. that are provoked by that relationship. And so the ruler is again kind of thrust into the middle, engaging in a kind of arbitrage as a function, again, of being in between. In this case, in between the people that he ruled and the foreigners whose support he has come to rely upon. So this pair of quotes from the late 19th century appears in a wonderful book by Hasan Kakar, who's one of Afghanistan's great historians. And you can see them side by side. They give us an insight into the kind of classic archetype that an Afghan ruler faces, in which he must broker between his people and the West. So on the one hand, we have a religious leader, a mullah, exclaiming at the end of the 19th century, "O people, our land has been seized by the infidels. It is our duty to God and his prophet to fight against the enemy of our faith and country. If we kill them, we will be heroes, and if we die, we will be martyrs. Either way, paradise will be our reward." And on the other hand, you have a British officer who says there is no doubt a very strong feeling of hostility against us, which all this indiscriminate hanging and burning of villages intensifies. In fact, we have not got a single friend in the country. So this is the kind of extreme classic stereotype we have of the Afghans who cannot be conquered. And what is, I think, most interesting about it is the degree to which the ruler of the Afghan state is managing those different impulses, which are not always or even often this dramatic, but I use this sort of as an illustrative case. So those are the one set of in-betweens that we think about, the state as in between various powers geographically and geopolitically, the ruler as in between the outsiders and the insiders. And then there is a kind of third in-betweenness that is the one with which I'm most concerned, which is what we must consider if we want to understand the way in which the Afghan state exists and survives. And that is the space in between the country's political center, Kabul, and its periphery or peripheries. So we know that state building across the world, whether it's in Afghanistan or anywhere else, is really about the work of bridging this particular gap, right? And so internationally, because my work is as much interested in what is happening inside Afghanistan as it is with the way in which the international community interacts with Afghanistan, we know that since the end of the Cold War, many in the so-called international community have been taken up with the project of promoting better forms of governance, as they're described, good governance in the developing world. And that agenda of good governance took on a more immediate sense of urgency after the attacks on September 11th, because in that moment, the notion of state fragility and therefore the counter of that, state strengthening, became linked in our imaginations to terrorism and counterterrorism. And then when insurgencies erupted in both Afghanistan and Iraq, Western policymakers and the military brass and aid organizations followed an impulse to double down on the construction of more effective and responsive government in both of these countries as part of their counterinsurgency campaigns. So ultimately, the universe of doctrines and campaigns and programs and policies that are deployed in the service of improved governance are always seeking, in the modern world, in one way or another, to close the gap, and in effect to vanish that which lays in between. But that would be quite a simple task if it were in fact that straightforward. What we actually know is that in order to understand why state building is so challenging, particularly in countries in Afghanistan, whether we're thinking about it as indigenous state building or foreign-led state building, we have to peer into that gap and sort of stay in that middle space for a while and figure out what lies in the middle. And since 2001, we find in that middle between the Afghan center and its peripheries, we see a range of international and Afghan actors, organizations, institutions that occupy this space. And they draw on and mobilize different forms of coercion, of capital, of social solidarity, in parallel in some cases, and in other cases at odds with the government in Kabul. And in that universe of non-state actors, the warlord became one brand of particular concern and interest. So warlords emerged from the Taliban regime's collapse with with an advantaged access to violence, to material wealth, and political influence, in large part because the U.S. military and its allies armed and funded them as proxies in the fight to overthrow the Taliban regime. And they came to dominate spheres of influence, which you can see on this map in blocks of color, not just in Kabul, but also across the provinces, the 34 provinces of Afghanistan. So for the new Afghan government to exist in any meaningful way after 2001, it would need to redress this power imbalance, right, or this asymmetry between this enormous amount of power being gathered at the periphery versus the new central government. Foreign states and international organizations and private contractors and NGOs all facilitated the institutional substantiation on paper of this new state that would be able to bridge this gap over the next several years. And part of the way in which that was done was the formal design of the state, which attempted to compensate for this power imbalance between center and periphery by constructing a highly centralized state that would deliver all sorts of public goods and services and draw the periphery closer to Kabul in the process, including through an appointment system of governors across the country's 34 provinces. President Karzai and his regime participated, of course, they were at the center of this de jure state-building project, but they pursued a set of parallel strategies to establish as much control and influence as possible over the periphery's political economy. And one of the ways in which President Karzai did that was by wielding this formal authority to make appointments. And my argument is that in order to tame the periphery as best he could, one of the means of doing that was to introduce actors with real strength into the empty shell that was formal government at the time. And so in my first book, I studied two strong men, Ata Mohammed Noor in the northern province of Balkh and Gulaga Sherzai in the eastern border province of Nangarhar, both of whom were sent to govern these very important two of the five most important provinces in the country by President Karzai. And the argument that I made in the book was that both of them were what I called just strong enough. So using a kind of Goldilocks rule, right? That they were just strong enough as warlords to make this transition from strong men into effective governors because they brought with them a kind of military might as well as economic and social capital. They were able to bring that with them into this otherwise anemic but very important formal position of governorship. But they also faced competition in the provinces, and so they were inclined to show their strength and leverage their strength, but also to stay close and rely on their patron in Kabul, President Karzai. So what's important to say, I think, about these appointments is that in many ways they undermine many of the principles and norms that we associate with the formal state-building project, right, and the project of bringing good governance to Afghanistan. But what I have argued, and I feel, and I'm happy to talk about the current situation in our conversation afterwards, I feel even more strongly today that their inclusion, while it may undermine many of those principles and norms, allowed for the emergence of provincial governance in two key border provinces just the same, and illustrated the fact that government and new governments that emerge after war can become these spaces in which strong men can reimagine their political futures in more constructive terms. And it's not only that they gain from being part of the state, but that they don't have to give up everything or lose in the process. And I think that is fundamental to our understanding of how states work in these kind of environments. So once I finished this project, I began to think more generally about whether it might be useful to recognize regime craft in settings like Afghanistan as a collection of maneuvers by which a ruler at the center manipulates competing peripheral power holders in order to exert influence and control. And so in his exposition on the nature of weak states in strong societies, the wonderful sociologist Joel Migdal wrote about something that he called the politics of survival. And he described what I'm talking about as the kind of space in between as one marked by, quote, arenas of domination and opposition where various social forces engage one another over material and symbolic issues, vying for supremacy through struggles and accommodations, clashes and coalitions. So the pursuits of a regime in that framing center on staying afloat in the face of various competing organizations and actors. And if I think about a different case, and this case feels relevant because we're talking about empire, I think about a different work by another wonderful sociologist, Karen Barkey, in her groundbreaking book on banditry and state formation, in which she shared a story of a 17th century bargain that took place between the Sultanate in Istanbul and a notorious bandit in northern Syria. And this bandit was a major power holder in this challenging and strategically valuable region, which we now associate with the stomping grounds for the Islamic State. This bandit exposed his intention to lend the empire the support of his 60,000 men in exchange for the material and symbolic trappings of state power. And so in 1606, he became the Ottomans' governor general in Aleppo. And his relationship with the imperial state proved very dramatic and turbulent. But the rationale behind the appointment reflected a kind of palace politics that, when I read it, felt strikingly resonant with modern logics of weak statehood in a place like Afghanistan. And so Barkey, in her work, she explained this as a patrimonial regime that ensured undivided control by either eliminating potential rivals or securing loyalty by incorporation into the household, had to develop a strong tendency for deal-making and brokerage. And so for me, if we just reduce that beautifully constructed sentence into one phrase, for me it is competition management. And what I argue is that this is the fundamental task of any regime in a weak state. And as it was for the Ottoman Sultan, it remained so when Hamid Karzai assumed his role as a national sovereign in Kabul's presidential palace and commenced what would become this historic tenure as Afghanistan's first elected leader. And so within this competitive space that was post-2001 Afghanistan, Karzai and his clique were able to leverage his formal authority to control subnational appointments in the struggle to remain above the fray. Karzai did not come with his own militia. He did not come with a serious amount of resources. And so his approach to gubernatorial appointments, which was commonly derided as a reflection of bad governance or being that he was only the mayor of Kabul, as he was called, I think instead could be understood as serving the vital purpose of managing competition. Again, a task that I think is at the heart of regime survival in a weak state. So what I argue in my new book project on Afghanistan is that Karzai used, amongst other things, his power to make subnational appointments as a means of maintaining a kind of unpredictability, of balancing and redistributing power, of dividing and conquering, rewarding clients, punishing spoilers, including many of them strongmen. In fact, by my count, of the close to 200 appointments that he made, 2/3 of those individuals had backgrounds as warlord commanders. So this political choreography read as cronyism and corruption to many in the West and to many in the Afghan elite as well. But for me, it was what Migdal wrote about as the politics of survival, a means by which Karzai could influence from the center this otherwise really unwieldy periphery. And so when I look at the pantheon of governors, as I said, close to 200 appointments, I am seeing the degree to which he spent his 12 years in office managing power through politics and using appointments to shape the dynamics at the periphery and also to protect his own turf in the center. And watching the way in which his own requirements evolved as his presidency progressed, as his re-election campaigns, for example, approached. and that the appointments represented a reliable means of shifting course. And the dynamism of this system and the president's significant authority to maneuver within it enabled Karzai to exercise, I think, a far greater degree of influence over subnational politics than would otherwise have been the case. Now, I want to be clear that many observers, including the preeminent anthropologist and mentor of mine, Tom Barfield, have less than charitable perspectives on Karzai, and I think it's important that we share them. So I will read you one of Professor Barfield's characterizations, in which he wrote, "Afghans were less sanguine because they saw Karzai in a different light, as a vacillating leader who was unwilling to confront his enemies or discipline his allies. This strategy of appeasing the discredited leadership from the Civil War period wedded Afghanistan to its failed past rather than charting a new future." So I think in this book, which is required reading for anyone who is interested in Afghanistan, one of the most important points that Barfield makes is that there was an appetite amongst Afghans, and I know this from my own experiences, having traveled there first in 2004 before the very first presidential election, right through this past summer, that there was a tremendous appetite amongst Afghans, not just in Kabul, but all over the country for a new kind of relationship with their government. And that appetite could have pointed us in the direction of governing institutions that were more devolved and a larger foreign footprint, and more generally for a government that was more involved in the lives of the people and delivering the kinds of goods and services that had never before been done by the Afghan state. My response to that is just a caution that an appetite for better governance does not necessarily or even often equate with a capacity on the part of a government to deliver, nor does it equate to a capacity on the part of foreign interveners to facilitate that delivery. And it certainly also does not preclude the possibility of strongmen, which many had hoped would be pushed to the margins, to become spoilers of the very project that would have been underway. So for me, ultimately, Karzai's approach to gubernatorial appointments afforded him opportunities to manage often violent competition in ways that not only undergirded his regime, but also amplified the capacity of the state by keeping key sources of coercion and wealth and social capital inside the state. So not only did these individuals and their associated factions and networks pose far less of a threat to the state as future spoilers, even as rebels, but they grew accustomed to sharing political space with each other in ways that they had not before. In fact, by my count, some 40% of the appointments that President Karzai made went to two particular factions who had spent several years during the Civil War fighting one another and destroying Kabul in the process. So now you have these individuals and their associated factions all sharing a space with one another and growing jointly invested in defending this undoubtedly weak state against other threats. And so the relationships between competition management, state building, and even counterinsurgency, I think, end up getting eclipsed by this focus on good governance. Insurgents represent, after all, the most antagonistic and therefore dangerous type of competition. And if done well, threats and potential threats to the state should be curbed or should be able to be curbed. And in the process, informal power holders can grow invested in defending rather than attacking the state they might otherwise have contested. I think it's worth noting that the hero of all good governance missionaries is Max Weber, who meditated on various occasions on government, but did so without leaving politics or power aside. On the contrary, he described politics as, quote, striving to share power or striving to influence the distribution of power among groups within a state. This particular dimension of Weber's argument can get lost in the language of rationality, regulation, and law, as well as the derivative focus on service delivery, on accountability, on democratization. These concepts feature frequently in the good governance discourse, and they do the work of obscuring or even maligning the role of politics and power in the governing project. So what I want to do in closing is actually introduce you to work by a colleague and friend of mine, anthropologist Noah Coburn, who is also a student of Tom Barfield's. And I want to share an anecdote from his beautiful book, Bazaar Politics, in which he tells the story of a decision that he witnessed happening in a small town outside of Kabul called Istalif, where he did his field work. And essentially, the town had been presented by a visiting NGO with a project to pave the main road out of the town to Kabul. And this town is very famous for its beautiful blue pottery. And so this road would have allowed easier access for merchants to take their goods to market, for tourists to come from Kabul to Istalif, and for everybody to have interaction for healthcare, for social reasons, for economic reasons with the capital. So he sat in on a meeting in the office of the district governor of this town with elders and the district governor and members of this NGO. And what he remarked on and what he spent several pages beautifully talking about was that despite the fact that everyone in the town would have benefited from being able to access the capital quickly and safely, the reconstruction project, there was unanimous agreement that no, we will not do the reconstruction project in the end. And the reason that he unearthed for that was because this particular paving of the road would have risked destabilizing local power dynamics between two very important elders in this town, one of whom lived right in front of the road and the other of whom did not. And that, in fact, those power dynamics could have been so much destabilized that there might have been actually the provocation of conflict in ways that were impossible to recognize from the outside, but were clear to those inside the community, and so they ended up turning down the free road. So more generally, having watched various episodes like this, Coburn reflected on what he called this kind of masterly inactivity. And he said, choosing inactivity preserved the status quo, while engaging in a power struggle risked defeat, which would result in the loss of honor. And for me, this anecdote is really quite profound because what it reveals is the value in stillness for a place that has so long been disturbed and defined by turbulence, violence, and ultimately war. And that the preservation of that stillness involves, again, a kind of politics that is oriented around accommodation of competitors and the management and muting of conflict. So what is interesting to me in that case is that the values that are associated with state building, with democracy promotion, with free market economics, with physical reconstruction, transparency, progress, profit, efficiency, speed, convenience, a fair playing field, these are not necessarily the values that are at a premium in a town like Istalif. And in some cases, they are actually at odds with the project of accommodation and management. To build is not to manage, right? And because, as the great political scientist Jim Scott made so clear, building involves confrontation, it involves capture, it involves change. And of course, all of that we could find in many cases in Afghanistan after 2001. But there were reasons why a community would fear that, why it would resist it, even at the expense of its own well-being across a number of other dimensions. And so I think ultimately it is the aim of interveners to fix that which is broken as a way of making life better, but also to build this ever-expansive architecture, this physical architecture and political architecture, by which people and their governments can engage one another. That is what Western interveners do. But perhaps there are moments when stillness, absence, weakness, accommodation, even retreat on the part of the state might actually reflect a kind of equilibrium rather than failure. And it may, at least, I would argue, be worth entertaining that possibility as we consider all of the ups and downs of state formation in places like Afghanistan and try and understand why our own efforts have met with so much challenge and resistance. So I will leave it there and look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.